Masechet Cholin, Daf Lamed Aleph. On the previous daf, we saw that the halacha always follows Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, and we saw a list of halachot that he said. And now we're going to learn one more. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, Pamachat nid'areb li tebel becholin, ubati veshalti et Rabbi Tarfon, v'amar li lech kach lecha min hashuk ve'aser alav. He said that one time he had tebel, that's grain that is untithed, and it did not take terumah, so it's prohibited, you have to separate it. And some tebel got mixed up in cholin. Cholin is produce that he did take the terumah and maaser, and now it's already kosher and can be used. And now they got mixed together, and this is a problem because now that it's mixed, you can't eat from that mixture because there's some tebel in it, and tebel is prohibited. Now, you want to come and separate terumah and maaser, well, you can't just take from some of that mixture because maybe you're only taking cholin, and now you're not. You have to take terumah and maaser from the tebel, but the tebel is all mixed into the cholin. So what do we do? And Rabbi Shimon says, he went and asked Rabbi Tarfon. And Rabbi Tarfon says, go buy from the marketplace some tebel. That would be tebel that's demai. In the marketplace, you're buying from a fellow Jew who's an Am Haaretz. And that means it could be he already took to the maaser, maybe not. And therefore, midrabanan, one has to take terumah and maaser from that tebel. So go buy tebel from the marketplace and take terumah and maaser from that on behalf of whatever tebel is mixed up with the chulin. So you'll say here, this portion of what I just bought is going to be terumah and maaser, and that will cover my obligation for that tebel that's in the mixture. And then you can eat the entire mixture. Kasabar deoraita beruba batel, veroba mehaaris me'asirim hem, hava le ketorem min hapetur al hapetur. And now the Gemara explains the mechanism here. In order, when you take terumah and maaser, it has to be from the same level. In other words, the tebel from which you are removing terumah and maaser has to be in the same halachic status as the tebel that you want to now turn into chulin, turn into food that you can eat. And it has to be either both the oraita status or both the rabbanan status. You can't take terumah maaser from something that is only required midrabanan to cover something that is required the oraita, or vice versa. And so, in order for this to work, it must be that on the deoraita level, the tebel that got mixed up with the cholin is batel. There was a majority of cholin and majority permitted produce, and minority of tebel fell into it. On the deoraita level, we could say it's batel. So really, on the deoraita level, it's kosher to eat just as is. Midrabanan, however, you say, look, it got mixed up, it's still problematic. And furthermore, if we assume that most Am Haaretz, most simple farmers who are not trusted to take to the maaser, even though we can't trust them 100%, but most of them do take to the maaser. And therefore, the obligation to take to the maaser from demai, which you buy from Am Haaretz, is also only midrabanan. So since both of them have only a derabanan status, it's tebel midrabanan. On the oraita level, both of these would be okay. You bought it from Am Haaretz, he probably took to the maaser. This tebel fell into the chulin, it's batel doraita. So on the oraita level, they're all fine. Oh, they're only obligated to take to the maaser on the drabanan level. So you're taking torem, you're removing from something that is patur medoraita, but obligated midrabanan, for another item that's patur medoraita, but obligated midrabanan. And therefore, this is a good solution. Velemalek lech kach min hagoy. Gemara asks, how come it be Tarfon said to go buy it from the marketplace, buy from Am Haaretz, and that would be demai? Why doesn't he say that you should go buy from a non-Jew? Kasabar en kinyan legoy be'eretz Yisrael leafkiya miyad maaser v'havale min hachiyub ala petur. It must be that the reason why Rabbi Tarfon said specifically buy it from the Jewish marketplace, and he didn't say buy it from a non-Jew, is because what is the status of produce that's grown on land that's owned by a non-Jew? Well, we're going to see there's two opinions here. And this opinion says, En kinyan legoy be'eretz Yisrael, that a non-Jew does not have full acquisition on the land of Israel. Even if he goes and buys it, so monetarily he owns it and he can do what he wants with that produce, he could eat it, he could sell it, and so on. But from a legal status in terms of Terumah Ma'aseh, we do not consider the non-Jew to be a full owner such that it would remove the obligation from Ma'aseh. We do not say that. Rather, even though a non-Jew owns the land, technically owns the land, still it's liable on the Doraita level. If once a Jew gets it, if a Jew buys it, he is obligated mi deoraita to take to the Ma'aseh. And therefore, that wouldn't work. If Rabbi Tarfon would tell the guy to go and buy tebel from a non-Jew, that would be something that you have to take to Ma'aseh midoraita, and you cannot take from that in order to exempt one's obligation on the tebel that got mixed up with cholin, which is only required midrabanan. So that's why he didn't say buy it from a non-Jew. Instead, he said buy it from an Ama Aretz. All that is one version of the discussion. Another version that's opposite. Ikad amre, amar le, lech kach min hagoy. Same situation. You had tebel that got mixed up with cholin. And Rabbi Shimon Shizuri didn't know what to do. And so he asked Rabbi Tarfon. And in this version, he says, go buy some tebel from a non-Jew. And then use that as Terumah Ma'aseh, and say I'm separating this as Terumah Ma'aseh to cover my obligation for the tebel that got mixed up in the cholin. According to this version, Kasabar, Yesh kinyan legoy be'eretz Yisrael afkiya miyad Ma'aseh v'havaleh min hapetur al hapetur. In this version, he thinks that a non-Jew can own a piece of the land of Israel fully, such that it does not have a biblical obligation to take Ma'aseh. Now, if a Jew buys produce from the non-Jew, then the Jew still has a derabanan obligation to take to the Ma'aseh. That's fine. That's good, because that matches the derabanan obligation to take to the Ma'aseh from the tebel that got mixed up with the cholin, because they're also on the Doraita level, it's batel berov, but on the Rabbanan level, it still has to take to the Ma'aseh. So that means petur ala petur, something that is not obligated midoraita, but yes, to the Rabbanan, you're using as to Ma'aseh for something else that has the same status. And now we ask the other way around. How come Rabbi Tarfon didn't tell him to go buy from the marketplace where there are Menaḥot, Jews who are simple farmers who are not 100% compliant with the law? Why not say buy from the shuk, kasabar, and roba me'haaretz me'asirin? Because in this version he thinks that most me'haaretz do not take ma'aser. Since they do not take ma'aser, when you buy from an me'haaretz, there's actually a biblical obligation to take ma'aser. And therefore, it wouldn't work, because a biblical obligation cannot cover for something that's only a drabanan obligation. And therefore, that he did not say to buy it from the shuk, but specifically to buy it from a non-Jew. Shelach le Rav Yemar bar Shelemya le Rav Papa. Had amar Ravin bar Chinena amar Ula amar Rabbi Chanina. Halacha ke Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. Velo od ela kol makom sheshana Rabbi Shimon Shezuri halacha kemoto. Haf benitarev le tebel becholin. Rav Yemar bar Shelemya sent a message to Rav Papa asking. When we quoted, and we discussed this quotation yesterday, we cited Ravin, the son of Chinena, who said in the name of Ula, who said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, that halacha is like Rabbi Shimon in some specific case. Yesterday we discussed which is the specific case he was talking about. We had a couple of options. And then Rabbi Chanina says further, and not only in that particular case, but anywhere, sheshana. Now the word shana is to teach a halacha by heart. And so shana could refer in a more limited way to a Mishnah. That's why it's called Mishnah, because one repeats it by heart. It could refer to any oral tradition, even if it's not in the Mishnah, like a Tosefta or a Baraita. So this word itself is ambiguous. Doesn't mean any time he taught it, or anytime he taught it in a Mishnah, or anytime he taught it in a Baraita? What does it mean? Anyway, he says, anytime Rabbi Shimon Shezuri taught halacha, taught a law, halacha follows him. Now, his question is, Rav Yemar, is a question to Rav Papa, is this true even in the case of this Baraita where Tebel falls into Chulin, and he told him, go buy from, there's two versions, either buy from Amaretz or buy from a non-Jew. As the halacha also, according to him, his question seems to be, do we follow Rabbi Shimon Shezuri only when it's in a Mishnah, like Shana specifically, or in a Baraita, anytime he says something, only if it's quoted in a Mishnah? How about in this case? Amar le'in, he says, yes, the halacha is like him also in this case. Amar Rav Asher, Amar li Mezuzah, kasher ba Rabbi Chanina misura peshita. Rav Asher says that Mezuzah told him that this is difficult. Rabbi Chanina from Surah, another Rabbi Chanina, had a difficulty with this conversation. Isn't this obvious? Like, why is Rav Yemar bar Shelemia asking Rav Papa this in the first place, such that Rav Papa had to answer, yes, the halacha is like him, right? Obviously, because Rabbi Chanina here said halacha is always like him, and so what's the problem? Why would you think not? Mi kamar b'mishnatenu, kol makom sheshana kamar. Did he say only in the Mishnah? He didn't say only in the Mishnah. In fact, he says kol makom, anywhere. So actually, this question was not necessary to ask. There was no reason to think that sheshana meant only in the Mishnah. He said kol makom, anywhere. If he meant only in the Mishnah, he would say be'mishnatenu. He didn't say mishnatenu, he said kol makom. And therefore, in fact, this was obvious, and it didn't even need to ask the question. Yes, for sure, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Shezuri in this case as well. And now we get back to the laws of writing Sifrei Torah and Mezuzot. Amar Rav Ze'ira, Amar Rav Hananel, Amar Rav. Another statement regarding these laws in the name of Rav. Kera haba bishne shitin yitpor. B'shalosh al yitpor. If there is a tear in the parchment, and the tear goes, let's say, from the top down and cuts through 2 lines of text, you can sew it up. Not if it's going to tear through a letter, because then the letter is not kosher. But let's say it tears between words or between letters, then you can sew it up, and that's okay. However, if it tears through 3 lines, then that's too many, and you cannot fix it. You have to replace the entire yiri'ah. The reason seems to be, number one, it won't look nice. And second, if it's that big, then it's not going to stay well. It'll end up tearing again. Amar le Rabba Zuti le Rab Asher. Hachi amar Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti mishemeh de Rabba. Ha de amrinan b'shalosh al yitpor, la amrinan ela be'atikata. Aval had tata let lan ba. And the Rabba Zuti tells Rav Asher that he heard in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah Medifti in the name of Rava, that when we said this halacha, Rav said this halacha, that if it's 3 lines or more that the tear goes through, then you cannot fix it, you cannot sew it up. That's only if it's an old parchment. But if it's a new parchment, then that's okay. It could be because a new parchment, number one, will look nicer, it's also stronger, and so it can hold that burden of the tear and sewn up. Vela atikata mamash. Vela chadetata mamash. And furthermore, the Gemara says, when we say old, we don't mean literally old, that the parchment is like 100 years old. And we don't mean, when we say new, that it's literally new, that it's only a year old. Ela ha de lafisan, ha de afisan. Rather, we mean, it depends on whether the parchment is processed with gall. Gall is something that's found on trees. It's a sediment from insects, an insect infestation on the tree. And if you would treat the parchment with gall, that strengthens the parchment. So therefore, it doesn't matter literally how old it is, but rather if it's treated with gall, then the parchment is strong, and therefore, even if the tear is big, it can be fixed and it will hold well. But even if it's new but not treated with gall, then it's going to be too soft and the rip will not hold well even when sewn up. Behanemile begidin aval bigradin la. And when we say that you can stitch it up and it'll hold well, in the cases when we said you can, that's only if you do it with a gid, with a sinew from an animal that's very strong, and you sew it up with that, and then it will hold well. That also is a kosher material that you use to attach one yedi'ah to the next. And so this is a proper material, and that's fine. However, if you just tie it, sew it up with a thread, that will not be good because the thread is too weak. Ba'er Rav Yehuda bar Abba, ben daf ledaf, ben shita leshita, mai teko. Rav Yehuda bar Abba asked, what if the tear is between one column and the next? And let's say it's a tear that would go, is long enough that it would go past 2 rows if there were writing there, but it's between the columns. So can you sew that up and fix it? What if it's a horizontal tear that's between 2 lines? Can that be fixed up? And we leave those questions unanswered. Amar Rabbi Ze'eri, Amar Rav Hananel, Amar Rav, Mezuzah sheketava shetayim keshera. And also another halacha from Rabbi Ze'eri, in the name of Rav Hananel, in the name of Rav. If you write a mezuzah 2 by 2, meaning 2 words on each line, it's still kosher. Unlike a Sefer Torah, we said the minimum width has to be lemishpechotehem 3 times across. So for almost the whole Torah, you have to have that minimum width. We said except for the very last column, that's okay. You could write just one word on a line, but otherwise it has to be a few words on a line. But in Mezuzah, you could write it thin and long. That's okay. And then the question is, it's okay if it's 2 words on every line. What if you want to make a pattern and you write 2 words on a line and then 3 words and then 1 word, and you make a pattern like that? Is that kosher? That is actually more like a poem. There are various poems in the Torah, 2 of them, Shirat Hayam and Ha'azinu, and those are written in certain patterns, like Shirat Hayam, long, and then 3, and then 3 sections, and then 2 sections, and then 3 sections, and 2 sections. And so that shows that it's a poem. And so if one wanted to write a mezuzah in this way, would that be acceptable? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kol sheken she'asa keshira. And he says, yes, all the more so. It's even more beautiful that it's prose. Shema is not poetry; it's just prose, and you're writing it like shira, which is even more beautiful. So all the more so, you're beautifying the text. So it's okay. Metibe asa keshira or shira kemota pesula. Hold on, we have a baraita that teaches if someone would write prose as a poem, or take a poem and write it as prose, then the Sefer Torah is pasul. You have to keep the genre of each thing. It's important how it looks. You also interpret poetry differently than one interprets things that are not poetry, and therefore you can't change one to the other, and therefore it should be that this is pasul. A mezuzah is prose, and you cannot write it as poetry. And the answer is Kitanyahi beSefer Torah. That baraita is talking about a Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah, you have to write the poems, the 2 poems as poems, and everything else you have to write as prose. But a mezuzah is different. Mezuzah, you can write it in a poetic format. Itemar name. Amar Rabba bar Hana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. V'amri la Amar Rav Acha bar Hana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Mezuzah she'asa shetayim v'shalosh v'achat keshera. V'vad shelo ya'asena kekuba. V'vad shelo ya'asena kezanav. We have another related law in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Some say it's Rabba bar Hana and Rabbi Yochanan. Some say it's Rav Acha bar Hana and Rabbi Yochanan. That if you write a mezuzah and you write it 2, 3, 1, you write 2 words, 3 words, 1 word, or 2 sections, 3 sections, 1 section, and you do that, you make a repeating pattern, that's okay. It looks beautiful, be like a poem. However, you have to make sure that you don't make it like a triangle, not like a tent. You start with 1 word, then 2, then 3, then 4, and just make it a triangle going out. That's not acceptable, nor like a shape, which should be the same thing upside down, that you start with a lot of words, and then you go down, and then 3, and 2, then 1. So a triangle or upside down triangle, that's not proper. That's just a shape, not really poetry. So it can be a pattern, but not a repeating pattern that looks nice, but not like a triangle pattern. Amar Rav Chisda, al haaretz b'shita acharona. Now, Rav Chisda says that at the end of the mezuzah, the words al haaretz have to be on the last line. Of course, they're on the last line because it's the last words, but he means it has to be on its own line. So you have to write kimeh hashamayim at the end of one line, and then the last line have to have the words al haaretz, and that's it, nothing else. When we write these words al haaretz on the last line, there's two opinions. Some say write it at the end of the line, all the way on the left. So you'd leave the whole space empty and then on the left. Others say on the right, like it is in this picture, al haaretz all the way on the right. Now, why would you do one or the other? The one who says to write it all the way on the left, that is neat because then you have the word hashamayim, and right below that is al haaretz. So you have physically the shamayim on top of the haaretz. So there you go. It's like a little diagram of the world. And so that's nice to put it at the end of the line. And the opinion that says to put it all the way at the beginning of the line is that so it should be far away, since the promise is Hashem will give you the land as long as the time he'll give you you will live on the land for as long as the distance is between Shamayim and Aretz. So we want to emphasize that Shamayim and Aretz are very far from each other, and so too we should remain on the land for a long time. Amar Rabbi Chelbo Hazena le Rav Huna decharich la me'ehad kelape shema ve'oseh parshioteha setumot. Rabbi Chelbo says that I saw that Rav Huna, when he made a mezuzah, after he finished writing it, he rolled it up. Now, which way should you roll it up? From the right to the left or left to the right? He would roll it up from the word ehad, which is towards the end of the line. It's not all the way at the end of the line, towards the end. And so he start rolling it on the left side, and then the Shema would be on the outside. And furthermore, there's two paragraphs here. So you're going to have a paragraph break. What kind of paragraph break? He said he would make it situmot, which it means not like it is in this picture. Situma means it's on the same line. You just leave a few spaces, like a tab, so that bisharecha might end towards the beginning of the row, and then leave some empty space, and then start vehaya on the same row. That's how he would do it. But we challenge this practice of Rav Huna from a baraita, Metibeh. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Meir haya kotva al doch sostos kemin daf. Rabbi Meir would write mezuzot on dochsostos. There's two parts of the hide of an animal. The hide of an animal is split into two. You split it down the middle. And then you have the outer layer, which is the klaf, the parchment that we usually use. And the inner part that's next to the flesh is called dochsostos. So he would write the mezuzah on the inner layer of the hide. And he would write it like a column of a Torah, meaning long and narrow, unlike tefillin, which you have a short and fat column. He would write his mezuzah long and narrow. And he would make sure to put an upper margin and a lower margin, a little bit of empty space, and not write all the way up to the top and bottom. And here's the main thing that we want, is that he would make a parasha petucha, which means that he would go to the next line, like it is in this mezuzah, in this picture here, leave off the empty that line and start V'hayim Shamoa on the next line. Amarti lo Rabbi Matam, and I asked him, Rabbi Meir, why are you doing that? Amar li ho'il ve'en semuchot min haTorah, and he said it's because these two paragraphs are not adjacent in the Torah. The Shema is in chapter 6 in Devarim, and Vayam Shema is in chapter 11 in Devarim. So since they're not near each other in the Torah, so you should not put them on the same line, but rather go to the next line. And furthermore, V'amar Rav Hananel Amar Rav Halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, my Lav Apituchot, and Rav himself said the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who reported this, that Rabbi Meir would write it Pituchot. So now when Rav says halacha is like that, well, there were a few halachot that we mentioned over here, but is he not including this law of Pituchot? And if so, that we have number one, a Braita. Furthermore, Rav himself, who is Rav Huna's teacher, said the halacha is like that, it should be Pituchot. Then how could Rav Huna write the paragraph as Situmot? All that is the question. And the answer is, Lo arevach. When Rav said halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he wasn't talking about all of the laws here. He was mentioning specifically that the halacha is you have to leave a little bit of empty space on the top and bottom margins. But he had actually, Rav himself did not necessarily agree that the halacha is Pituchot, and that's why Rav Huna said, no, that's not the halacha, but rather it's a Situma between the paragraphs. Good, so that's we answered that question. Now that you mentioned that you have to leave a margin, and that is the halacha, v'kama revach, how much of a margin? We saw in the Sefer Torah, it's a width of a fist on top, 3 fingers on the bottom. Amar Rav Menashia bar Yaakov, Amri la Rav Shemuel bar Yaakov, kimelo atba desifre. And so someone says in a name, either Rav Menashia, the son of Yaakov, or Rav Shemuel, someone who's the son of Yaakov, said that is the size of a scribe's clip. The Sofrim would use a clip to hold the parchment down so it wouldn't roll up, and that had a certain size. That's how big the margin has to be. It's a very small amount. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef, ve'at la tizbera, techi amar Rav arevach. And then Abaye tells Rav Yosef, do you not agree with what we just said here, that when Rav says the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, do you not agree that he was talking specifically about the space in between, and not about that it should be pituchot, but rather that it should in fact be a situma? Do you not agree with that? Veha Rav itle min haga, veha'idana nehug alma be-situmot. After all, Rav himself, when he has a custom, he says that you should follow the custom. In other words, if people are practicing a certain thing, Rav said the community practice, the common custom, has to be kept. And even if you find some source or another that says that it should be done differently, he says no, follow the common practice. That itself has a lot of authority. He says that in general, we're going to see where that comes from. Now, nowadays, if you look around, people write it situmot, and therefore it makes sense that we should also continue and write it situmot. So therefore it does not make sense that Rav would say that halacha is that it's pituchot. Now, to prove this point, we're going to quote an example where Rav says that you should follow the common custom. The Amar Rabba Amar Rav Kahana Amar Rav. Im yavo Eliyahu v'yomar chosin b'min'al shom'in lo. En chosin b'sandal en shom'in lo. Shekevan nahagu ha'am b'sandal. When one does halitza, there's a choice. What should you use for the halitza? The woman takes off the shoe from the man, from the yavam. So you can use a min'al, which is a regular shoe, or a sandal. Now, what the common practice is to use a sandal. Can you use a shoe? We're not sure. So therefore, we do not use a shoe. If you did use a shoe, okay, it's likely to be fine. Now, when Eliyahu Navi comes one day, and if he should teach us that you can use a min'al, then we will listen to him, because we weren't sure if you could use it or not beforehand. And if he comes and says that's the halacha, then fine, we will say that a min'al is kosher. If he comes, however, and says you cannot use a sandal, we would not listen. Even Eliyahu Navi comes, the times of Mashiach, here's the law. We wouldn't listen to him, because this is the custom of Israel, that we use a sandal. So now he's going to come and say the sandal's not good. What are you going to go? Retroactively for the past thousands of years? All those chalitza are not good? No, we have a custom, and the custom, that is the law, and we're not going to change it, not even for Eliyahu Nabi coming and tell us otherwise, and certainly not because there's a baraita, some tradition that says otherwise. So you look how Rav held fast to tradition. There's another version of this statement. Rav Yosef Amar Rav Kana Amar Rav. Im yabo Eliyahu v'yomar en chosin b'min'al shom'in lo, en chosin b'sandal en shom'in lo, shekevar nahagu ha'am b'sandal. This is Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Kana. Before we had Rabbah in the name of Rav Kana, both in the name of Rav. If Eliyahu Nabi will come in the future and say, you cannot use a shoe, we would listen to him. Again, this is the opposite of this one, but we would listen to him either way. If he says, you can use a shoe or not use a shoe, because we had no tradition about a shoe. People we don't use it, lechatechila, because we're not sure if a shoe is good or not. So whatever he says about the shoe, we would listen, even if he says it's invalid. However, if he says, same thing, that you cannot use a sandal, we would not pay attention to Eliyahu Nabi because we have a custom. So you see that he takes customs very seriously. Ve'amrinan by Benaihu, regarding this difference between these two versions, between Rabbah and Rav Yosef, when we analyzed that, we wondered what would be a practical difference between the two, and we answered, Min'al lechatechila ika Benaihu. The question, it would be a difference if we can use a shoe lechatechila nowadays. In Rabbah's formulation, he says, if Eliyahu Hanavi would come and say, you can use a shoe, then we would use it, which means that according to him, nowadays we should not use it lechatechila because we're not sure. So do not use it lechatechila. But the avad will accept the chalitza because probably it's okay, but lechatechila we would not use it unless Eliyahu comes and says that you can use it, so then we would change our ways and we would use it. So that means nowadays, do not use it. Whereas Rav Yosef, his formulation was, if Eliyahu Hanabi comes and says, do not use it, then we would listen to him. That sounds like nowadays we do use a shoe. We're not 100% sure about it, but it seems, yes, it's okay, so we use a shoe. Unless he says otherwise, then we would stop using it. But it means until then, we do use a shoe lechatechila. Anyway, the point of quoting both of these statements in the name of Rav is that Rav, when you have a common practice, he takes that as 100% authority that overrides even Eliyahu Hanabi and certainly will override a baraita. And therefore, it doesn't make sense that Rav would go against the common custom, and the common custom is to make it situma. And he would not override that and follow a baraita that said that is petucha. And therefore, when Rav says the halacha is like that baraita, certainly he was not talking about halacha being like that you should write it petuchot, but rather he was saying that the halacha is regarding the margin arevach shemamina, that you have to leave a little bit of a margin on the bottom and the top. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.